Before we start, I just wanted to say that today is a free admission day, so I encourage you to visit the President Nixon's birthplace, the White House right across the way. Take that in, also visit the memorial sites and visit the galleries to learn about the life of this extraordinary man when I'd become President of the United States. Another extraordinary man is Stephen Hess, who will be our Nixon Legacy lecturer today. Mr. Hess began his career in the Eisenhower administration as a speechwriter, and he joined President Nixon for his 1962 California gubernatorial bid. He returned to the White House in 1969 as the chief of staff to Daniel Patrick Moynihan. It was somewhat of a political odd couple because you had Moynihan, who is the urban affairs advisor, a Democrat, coupled with President Nixon, obviously a Republican. But the two were very loyal friends, and they made their relationship work. And Mr. Hess knew both of these. He's one of the few people that could say that he was close friends to both of these men. And it's the subject of his new book, The Professor and the President, Daniel Patrick Moynihan and the Nixon White House. But before we introduce Mr. Hess to the stage, we have a preview video to show.
Mr. Daniel Patrick Moynihan is assistant to the President for Urban Affairs. Indeed, the last time I saw him was once. He was speaking at a rally for Hubert Humphrey, appropriately scheduled on Halloween night, at which the orators were predicting the end of the world if Nixon was elected the following week.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
This was an incredibly close election in 1968, and he was coming in with an opposition Congress, and he really felt he needed some prominent Democrat. And strangely, he turned to Pat Moynihan and put him on his White House staff, a very high risk. You put opposition people in the cabinet because you can fire them very easily. You put them on their White House staff, and if they quit, you're in trouble. I had been a speechwriter for Nixon when he ran for governor of California in 1962. It was a professional, it was a political relationship, but it was close. Moynihan was totally different. It was neither professional nor political. We were simply good friends. It was a very unusual White House to have a Richard Nixon staff that is all very uptight, and then throw into the mix this 6'5" super elf wandering around the basement of the West Wing, and it turned out, strangely enough, the real Nixon staff, if you will, loved him. The Medal of Freedom actually was invented by Pat Moynihan when John Kennedy was president, and when Pat was in the White House with Nixon, he had the pleasure of putting together a list for the president, a list that included Duke Ellington.
This name on here, and it says Edward Kennedy Ellington.
Nixon played Happy Birthday as best he could.
Duke Ellington is ageless, but would you all stand and sing Happy Birthday to him, and please in the key of G.
Moynihan, who got many things through the White House, which was surprising, I think was trying to build a sense of Nixon to be historic.
The President of the United States tonight proposed something that no president had ever proposed, no nation, no industrial democracy, no nation of any kind had ever had.
This was a big surprise. Nixon had actually, in his campaigned against this idea, which basically was a negative income tax.
The other thing I really want to be clear about is we have to use the word welfare. All right, it's not a bad word, nothing wrong with that word. I think people who think it's a bad word ought to get rid of their good conscience, frankly.
But clearly it was something on their mind that ultimately produced the Family Assistance Plan, which Nixon had to get on television and say, yeah, but this is more expensive. But it's the right thing to do.
Initially, this new system will cost more than welfare. But unlike welfare, it is designed to correct the condition it deals with.
Pat felt very deeply about the question of dependency and family. And of course, his father had deserted his family when he was a young fellow, too.
The father is unable to find a job at all or one that will support his children. And so to make the children eligible for welfare, he leaves home.
For Pat, creating a new welfare system was his white whale. It was the major thing that he wanted to do in the 2 years that he was given to serve in the Nixon administration. And he did it.
I therefore propose that we abolish the present welfare system and that we adopt in its place a new family assistance system.
Mr. President, I'm sure he thought of himself as changing the configuration of the world greatly, but I never think he thought of doing this domestically. And really, it was Moynihan who created the opportunity for Nixon to take advantage of the presidency.
Ladies and gentlemen, a friend of the Nixon Foundation, President Nixon, Stephen Hess.
Thank you, Jonathan. Start by taking the cap off the bottle. Jonathan, Dwight Eisenhower used to tell his staff that he had a favorite cartoon from the old Saturday Evening Post. Had a man standing on a platform like you did, and he's saying, "The next speaker needs all the introduction he can get." So I thank you for your introduction. I love that little 4-minute film that we just did. It was produced by George Burroughs at Brookings, and I loved having the president play Happy Birthday to Duke Ellington. I wish George had kept in the next scene, which was Ellington in the French style kissing Nixon on both cheeks, and Nixon, of course, blushing. I do want to add something that I would not otherwise had mentioned when I took this assignment. But one of our colleagues on the White House staff died on January 3rd, and his funeral was yesterday. His name is Marty Anderson. When you read my book, you'll see he's a very prominent player in this particular story. He's most famous for what he did when he came back on the Ronald Reagan administration. But he did one thing very important, and it happened to be something that in the earlier ceremony, Admiral Lorge talked extensively about, and that was Richard Nixon creating what became the Volunteer Army. That was actually a proposal that was developed by Marty Anderson. I had one little story. Marty Anderson and I were on the same plane, flying from Los Angeles to San Francisco in 1970. And the movie that they showed us was called The Greatest Game in Town. I'm sure nobody remembers it. Elizabeth Taylor was in it, Warren Beatty was in it. The town, of course, was Las Vegas, and it was about gambling. And it inspired Marty to tell me this story. When he was getting his PhD at MIT, would have been in the early 60s, and he had access to the great computer at MIT, and he thought that maybe he would handicap the races at Suffolk Downs, which was the closest thoroughbred track to Boston. And then he went on and told me everything that he put in the computer, and this went on and on. All of the jockeys, their records, all of the horses, their records, all of the trainers, their record, all of the conditions of the track, all of the weight of the horses, and on he went, telling me as a scholar all of the data he had put into the machine. And then he said, "I got so good that I could break even." So I remember Marty Anderson today. I think the easiest way to get into the story that I want to tell you, the professor and the president, is to read to you a few of the first pages that sort of set the scene, and then we can go in later to the plot of the story. If I can find the first. Okay. I am the only person, perhaps in the world, who was a friend of both Richard Nixon and Daniel Patrick Moynihan before they knew each other. The Professor and the President is the story of the consequences of their paths crossing in 1969 when a conservative president made a liberal professor his urban affairs advisor in the White House. For Moynihan, this was a trajectory that changed his life, ultimately to become U.S. ambassador to India, appointed by Nixon, U.S. representative to the United Nations, appointed by President Ford, Nixon's successor, and through his celebrity at the United Nations to the U.S. Senate, where he was elected 4 times from New York. For Nixon, it imbued his domestic policy with a progressive cast that he had neither promised nor imagined. I first met Nixon just after he lost the presidency to John F. Kennedy in 1960 and returned to California. I had been a speechwriter for President Eisenhower from 1958 to 1961, when Nixon was vice president. Nixon was not a presence in the White House because he didn't have an office there, as subsequent vice presidents have. Eisenhower, in fact, considered the vice presidency to be constitutionally part of the executive branch. When it was over, Eisenhower got in his old car and was driven home 80 miles to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For presidents then, they didn't get staff and offices and all the other perks that they now require. The Republican National Committee determined that to keep Eisenhower politically active, someone had to answer his mail. And the job that I accepted was to be piecework, paid so many cents for each letter. What we failed to anticipate was the deluge. It was as if every schoolboy in America wanted Ike's opinion on what was that year's national debate topic. Others wanted something for their charity auctions, or an autograph, or just wanted to say hello. These letters provided the windfall that allowed me to become an independent writer. Whenever I heard a friend of Eisenhower had won an award, received an honorary degree, had a marriage or a death in the family, I would draft a little letter for him to send along, and soon people were stopping me and telling me, I got the nicest note from the general. That's how Eisenhower liked to be called at that time. All this was arranged by Bryce Harlow, who had been chief congressional lobbyist in the Eisenhower White House and was now the go-between for everything Republican in Washington. He also instructed me to attend to any needs Nixon might have. Nixon was now a rainmaker for a Los Angeles law firm. He was proud to have a considerable income for the first time in his life and to be able to build a home in the Truesdale Estates neighborhood in Beverly Hills. But he was bored. If I have to play golf one more time with Randolph Scott, I may go out of my mind, he once told me. He missed the political gossip that had fueled his Washington life since 1947. I tried to oblige by writing him what amounted to a newsletter with a subscription list of 1. I did not actually meet Nixon in person until the spring of 1961, when he wanted help writing articles for the Saturday Evening Post and other publications. Visiting Washington, he borrowed a desk in the law office of Bill Rogers, who had been Eisenhower's attorney general. These were the days before large LA firms would have their own offices in Washington. After we discussed the articles that he wanted, he said, incidentally, don't send me those draft letters. I don't want to be remembered as one of those politicians who remembers people's birthdays. A lesson learned. Eisenhower, the warrior, was a natural politician. Nixon, the politician, was not. I also learned how comfortable it was to help Nixon on writing his projects, which I continued to do for the next 3 years. Unlike many public figures who seemed to resent having words written for them, Nixon admired writers. He told me that writing Six Crises, his episodic and compelling account of his political career, from the Alger Hiss case in 1948 through his presidential run in 1960, was the most difficult thing he had ever done. Moreover, he was exceedingly generous, often splitting large fees with me. I said he was paying me too much, and he was embarrassed. And he said, I'd only have to give the money to the IRS. Much about Nixon, I learned, was different from the public perception. If my friendship with Nixon was largely professional and political, with Moynihan it was neither. Pat and I had been socially connected by Arthur Goldberg, then the Secretary of Labor, and Pat's boss in the Nixon administration. And Goldberg, as was his style, had declared from on high that we were two young men who were going to be friends, and he was right. Pat and I instantly liked each other, and when we both lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we saw a good deal of each other. And through the years, the memories compounded. At the Moynihan's upstate New York farm in Pindar's Corner, he declared to our teenage children, pointing to a sumptuous vegetable patch, "Future leaders of America, go forth and pick the corn for dinner." Trapped in Washington on a boiling July Sunday, the new senator called to propose a picnic. He had secretly discovered there was a grotto on the Capitol grounds where the wine would stay cool. And so my wife Beth and I joined Pat and his wife Liz, as we would do many times and years later for their 40th anniversary in Istanbul. After Pat's death in 2003, Liz said, "You loved him and he loved you. Was there anything of Pat's that you'd like to have?" 3 bow ties, I said. "But you don't wear bow ties." "Yes, but I will have them framed and will have them with me whenever I'm at home. If you should buy the book, and on the back cover, you'll find the 3 bow ties. And you'll see that Liz did something very clever. She gave me rather ratty bow ties. They didn't look as if they were new and fresh. They looked as if they had been worn. Now, on December 10th, 1968, at the Nixon Transition Headquarters at the Pierre Hotel on New York's Fifth Avenue, the president-elect announced that Daniel Patrick Moynihan, 41, will join the White House staff as assistant to the president for urban affairs. Professor Moynihan will take a 2-year leave from his position at Harvard, and Nixon said that he will create, by executive order, a new council that will serve as domestic counterpart to the National Security Council. The next day's Washington Post, Moynihan was described as 6 foot 5 inches of corrosive wit, infuriating candor, and towering intelligence, and so forth. How did Moynihan come to be Nixon's Democrat? The year 1969 was not a good one for a Republican to become president. Nixon won by a bare margin over Hubert Humphrey, and he joined, and as he took office, both houses of Congress were controlled by the Democrats. So he felt he needed a Democrat in his administration. Usually, as I said in the film, you choose a Democrat in your cabinet because you can fire that person. But instead, he picked Moynihan to be an close advisor to him, which was an incredibly high-risk proposition. Remember, he did not know Moynihan. In fact, he asked a young man on his staff who had gone to Harvard, "Is Moynihan called Dan or Daniel?" And of course, everybody knew he was called Pat. They didn't know each other. So he was taking this tremendous risk in appointing him. Moynihan, who was close to the Kennedys. I mean, if there were any people who the Nixon didn't much care for, it was the Kennedys. He was from Harvard. We know what the president thought of Harvard. And he was a liberal. Why pick him? Why would Moynihan, on the other hand, choose to go with Nixon? Nixon was the person most despised by the liberal community of Cambridge or the Upper West Side in New York. And in a sense, Pat was giving up his future in his own party. What had happened, however, was that he didn't have a future in his own party. In 1965, Pat wrote, while he was Assistant Secretary of the Labor, Pat wrote a very serious report to be sent to the President on the Negro family, which talked at some length with the pathology of the underclass. It was immediately despised by liberals and, of course, by other important elements in the Democratic coalition, to the degree that he was on the outs. He could not possibly have gotten an appointment from Lyndon Johnson at that time, nor, in fact, would he, as he points out, from Hubert Humphrey, if Hubert Humphrey had been elected. So suddenly, if there was ever something that Pat Moynihan, who had worked his way up the political scale, started with running in a campaign for governor of New York for Averill Harriman. When Harriman was elected, he became his assistant. When Kennedy was elected, he became an assistant in the Labor Department. And suddenly, his career was over because no one would accept him who had said these things about the sociological nature of the lower class Negro. So they joined forces. Joining forces was tricky for Nixon, and in some ways he responded by the first day that he went to work, January 21st, 1969, he had in his office Arthur Burns, an old friend of his from the Eisenhower administration, who had been preparing transition reports and was going to deliver them to the president, to which point the president said, well, I'm now going to appoint you counselor to the president, and this is your desk around, and this is your chair in the cabinet. Burns was really quite bowled over. He had rejected the idea of working in the presidency. He was coming to California on a sabbatical, and he expected that in a year's time, when the job was open, he would be appointed the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. But he could not say no to the president. So suddenly, what does the president have? Our point, he's got two competing Ivy League professors, one a liberal Harvard social scientist, the other a conservative Columbia economist, and they are in conflict. And what happens is they're in conflict in about the way that you would like people to be in conflict where there are disputes in the White House. It could have been conducted in a faculty lounge. It was of a very high order of this. Now, Nixon probably didn't expect this to happen. Nixon's model of how his government would operate was basically foreign policy. He and Henry Kissinger would sit in the corner and decide what was foreign policy. But in domestic affairs, he turned to the Eisenhower model, in which Eisenhower reached out to his cabinet. The cabinet basically worked out decisions. If there was any dispute between the Secretary of Labor and the Secretary of Commerce, Sherman Adams, the chief of staff, would bring them in, lock the door, and tell them, I'll let you out when you've resolved the conflict. So that the Eisenhower model was to push these questions out into the cabinet. But what happened was, and the point is, Eisenhower, one, knew exactly how to run an organization. He had run a war. And being as successful as he was able to get the cabinet officers he wanted. Well, Nixon, and he won a big election, so people were devoted to him. Nixon had none of these advantages. He had never run a big organization, and he had to choose many cabinet officers who were not necessarily his first choice. And so he started this Urban Affairs Council, which was a meeting of the domestic cabinet, and pretty soon he couldn't stand it. He had three governors on the former governors, and they didn't shut up. Shut up, he would say. And after a while, he just told Bob Haldeman, keep me away from that. And in turn, he turned to this conflict, if you want to call it a conflict, this debate for urban policy, not through his cabinet, specifically, but through Burns and Moynihan. Now, if you had a game of paper, rock, cut, and so forth, who would win? It would have to be Burns. Burns, first of all, was a Republican. Moynihan was not. Burns was a friend of the president's. Moynihan was not. Burns had all of the advantages to win, and yet he didn't win. So if this book is really thought of as three mysteries, the first mystery revolves around why Moynihan picked Nixon and why Nixon picked Moynihan. And it's complicated. I just summarized it, a bit of it. The second would be what happened in this internal struggle over policy, and why would Moynihan win most of the battles, and what battles were not just won by substance. A little had to do with style as well. Moynihan was thoroughly engaging. He was funny. He attracted the people on the staff. Haldeman and Ehrlichman, for example, liked him. And Burns was boring. You know, he pulled on his pipe and you had to wait till the next word came out and that sort of thing. Brilliant man, but boring. And these things entered into the equation. Early on, Moynihan was winning some battles because they were afraid of losing him. Before they were sure of his loyalty, they would bend over backwards a little in his favor. Good. But as it became clear that Moynihan, and remember, Moynihan was publicly against the Vietnam War. He had been a founder of many of the Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty program, which Nixon ran against, and so forth. Yet his commitment to the president was not to say anything public about any of these disputes. That's not why he was there. He said things privately to him. He said the war is a disaster and I wish I had all that money to spend for other reasons. But publicly, he never said anything. And as he proved his loyalty, this was very important to Richard Nixon. Loyalty was a major component of it. People who had been disloyal to him, probably in his youth. And they became close. It became a real friendship. It became a friendship that was founded in a very funny way. When Moynihan was picked in December, still a month before the inauguration, he started to send memoranda to the president. Now, a memoranda to the president, I know because I was on the Eisenhower staff, is as short as it can be. Bang, bang, bang. The president is busy, the staff is busy. But not the not the Moynihan memoranda. The Moynihan were long, convoluted, complex. They were even about subjects that the president couldn't do anything about. But Moynihan thought, the president should know about this. This is interesting. And so where a memo is usually from an underling to the boss, an authority to somebody who needs that, these were memos that clearly were intellectual to intellectual. And Richard Nixon had never received memos like that before. And he loved them. And what did he do? Unfortunately, he started to send them around to people, which meant that ultimately they would leak and they would cause some problems for Pat Moynihan. But this was a strange way that they started to meet through these memoranda. Nixon, particularly at the stage when he was not very anxious to be sitting around with his own cabinet, moved the executive office, the Oval Office became largely a symbolic office. Across the street, he created another office. And he would invite Moynihan in, and they would have conversations. And the president would say, Pat, what political biographies should I read? And Pat would say, read Blake on Disraeli. Read the book on Melbourne, and so forth and so on. And you know what? The president, who apparently had a sleeping problem, would get up at 2 and 3 in the morning, would start reading these books. And through these books, Pat sort of said, hey, you can be like Disraeli, a conservative prime minister with liberal ideas. What was going on all these times was Burns, who was the economist, who largely was cutting the budget and by the way, was probably right, and Moynihan, who was promising hope. A family assistance plan, which is really the basic story of this book, was about something that Pat couldn't prove. He understood that. Pat was famous for the phrase, you can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts. Well, he didn't know what the facts would be when suddenly he designed what amounted to a negative income tax. But it was very attractive to the president, and the president chose it. So the second mystery that gets solved, and obviously more complicated than I've explained it, is the fight between Moynihan and Burns. The third mystery that has to be solved is why would Richard Nixon, the conservative, choose this? Now, Pat had a great advantage over, let's say, Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, when he joined the Nixon administration, knew exactly what the president's beliefs were in foreign policy. And that's why he was chosen. They meshed. But there were no beliefs that Pat could mesh to. A very strange part about Nixon, which I knew very well because I had been in his campaign in '62, where in truth it ultimately showed, as he showed in his memoirs, that he wasn't even that interested in local domestic issues. And yet, how could a man who was so excessively seeking the presidency avoid U.S. domestic issues? And Pat, who went to see the president, and they worked out the arrangements at the Hotel Pierre in New York, and he called me and he said, come here, and then he came down, we had dinner, and he was just very excited with what he had learned. And he said to me about the president, he said, he's ignorant, meaning he didn't know anything about these social policies that Moynihan was telling him about. And I said, because I knew Nixon, I said, he's not ignorant, he's disinterested. And I gave him an example, Pat an example. When Nixon was running for governor, and he knew he was going to lose, and on election day, he called me because I was going to be going home back to Washington the next day, and I said, Dick, you still think you're going to lose? And he said, yes, but I'm never going to have to talk about crap like dope addiction again. It's a local issue. It was outside of his issues of how to settle the problems of the Soviet Union or Vietnam. So in a strange way, Pat was much advantaged over Henry in that he had a blank slate to work upon. And he was not only was he an educator, but he was a brilliant bureaucratic politician. He knew when to move and when not to move. And this was very important with Richard Nixon. Nixon was a moderate, but he was a moderate by splitting the difference. He was a moderate by, if he moved right on a Supreme Court decision, you could be sure he was going to move left on the next decision, and somehow that's how he was going to come out in the middle in a strange way. And Pat knew when to move and how to move. So the book describes not only this fight, but the excitement of being at the White House. There's a chapter we were all in the basement of the West Wing. The basement was the Nixon staff, the Kissinger staff, the staff mess, men's room, the place you got your hair cut. And interesting things happened, fun things happened as well. There was a couch that was opposite the security post, which was next to the Situation Room. And there was always some important person sitting on that couch, because Henry Kissinger was always late for an appointment. And a lot of these people were Hollywood celebrities. Somehow they were attracted to Kissinger, and they sat there. And one day I'm walking by, and I look, and I say, it's Kirk Douglas. And I get up a little nerve, And I said, hello, Mr. Douglas. You're waiting for Henry Kissinger? Yes, I am. He's always late. Why don't you come into my office and we'll have a cup of coffee while you're waiting? Better than sitting there and have everybody stare at him. So he comes into my office, and next door is Pat's office. I rush into Pat's office. Hey, I've got Kirk Douglas here. So he comes in, the three of us sitting there. We don't talk about politics, we talk about the movies. And that was a bit of life, or another story. I had, in 1968, when in Cambridge, I had debated Henry Kissinger. He had represented Nelson Rockefeller. I had Nixon, and all the school children, school people of kids of Boston were gathered in the audience. Kissinger was really quite nervous. I don't think he'd ever talked to a 16-year-old before in his life. I was quite sure that I could win the debate because I was talking about the one issue that I knew the kids would like, which was the volunteer army. But at any rate, we had the debate, and then a year later, we find ourselves both housed in the west basement of the White House. If we happened to come in at the same time in the morning, I would say, Henry, when are you going to solve that damn war so we have some money for our domestic problems? And he said, Steve, why don't you have another good riot so I have enough tough time to solve this war? And this went on and on. And it also happened very often, we were in the men's room at the same time. And one morning at this point, we're at separate urinals, and Henry Kissinger leans over and he says, Steve, you were right. This is the right man for this moment in history. That was life in the West Basement. Actually, it's very interesting. I was only in the Situation Room once, and the issue was drug use, which of course was an international issue as well as a domestic issue. I remember it very clearly because we sat around the table. There was some big Vietnam speech that night, and Henry got up at some point and said, excuse me, but I have to go and translate the president's speech from the original German. That was Henry. Life went on until through '69. Remember, you take a leave at Harvard for 2 years, and the end of '69, Moynihan had won a great victory. Nixon had gone on television and announced the Family Assistance Plan. And so the end of '69, it should have been a victory lap for him. He had accomplished amazing things. In fact, a lot of little things as well. You think of the great things. But it was almost as if Nixon, his friend, had said to him, you can do anything you want as long as it doesn't cost much money or embarrass me. And so in the book, there are a whole stream of little things, not the big fan that you go on television, little things. For example, the statistical systems at that time in the United States listed people as either white or non-white. That was it. And Moynihan sends a note to Nixon, says, this is outrageous. How can you treat people as just non-white? And Nixon says, good idea, do something about it. So Moynihan calls in all of the various bureau agencies, Bureau of the Budget, Labor, Commerce, and says, okay, what shall we call other people? And they work this out, and it's all, the system was changed. That's the little things that are important that you could do. For example, all of the domestic agencies configured the United States in different ways. So the headquarters of Small Business Administration might be in Chicago, but for housing might be in Kansas City. It really didn't make any sense. And Moynihan said, we've got to move quickly and change these districts so that they're all the same headquarters, same district. And he starts to do that, and the president announces it, and then all hell breaks loose. Nobody notices till it's changed, and then suddenly the senator says, hey, but why isn't there something in Seattle? That sort of thing. So you go back to the drawing board. Instead of 8 districts, you now have 10, and everybody is happy. And suddenly these 5 or 6 agencies actually do have the same configuration. So this is what was going on, and now as we enter 1970, how am I doing on time? Because I want to leave a lot of time for questions. Okay, 1970, the year in which it should have been a cakewalk. And there were accomplishments. One thing, for example, when Kennedy died, Moynihan had a commitment to do something about Pennsylvania Avenue, the great sweep between the White House and the Capitol, which had become crummy, liquor stores and booths for steaks and things, and Pat's got a commission and started to put it together. But of course, as everything, there was opposition. A lot of local people didn't like to move their businesses and whatnot. But he did ultimately get Richard Nixon to help back it, and they did ultimately change it. If you go to Washington, you're going to see a great sweep. That really was a sweep. And actually, there's a little corner of it that's called the Moynihan Corner, too, by the Smithsonian. So there were lots of things, some things that were getting done. But suddenly there was Cambodia. And we were into another country, although they denied we were in another country. Now, I should make it clear. Moynihan was not a dove. Moynihan was not against the use of force. He was against the use of force in this particular war. And he believed firmly, truthfully, that Nixon wanted to end the war. And Nixon, as the president, had the right to try to get us out of the war. But going into Cambodia caused a great uproar, particularly among young people. Hundreds of thousands of them were now surrounding the White House. And some people in the administration, including the vice president, were saying awful things about these kids. I mean, they were our children. They weren't gangsters or anything. They were just protesting. Moynihan didn't like that at all and wanted Nixon to do something about it. Also, there was Kent State. And kids were killed. Things were starting to fall apart for this relationship. The Family Assistance Plan was ultimately defeated in the Senate Finance Committee by one vote. An important memo that Nixon received from Moynihan, the benign neglect memo, was leaked. There were so Moynihan quietly offered his resignation to Nixon because he was an embarrassment, and Nixon refused it. Moynihan got letters from his colleagues at Harvard, said, leave that administration with a bang, and we'll welcome you back to Cambridge. He resigned, but he didn't resign publicly or with a bang. He just sent a letter to the president. The president said, I understand, but will you stay through the summer to help me pass the Family Assistance Plan? He said he would. Then, suddenly, the president goes to Camp David, gets an idea, calls Haldeman and says, hey, why don't we send Moynihan to the United Nations? Moynihan ultimately got there, but it was under Ford. We're now talking about the summer of 1970. And Haldeman said, that's a good idea. They asked Moynihan, and Moynihan loves the idea. To be the spokesman of the United States to the world, what more could this educator want? For some reason, they don't announce it. And secondly, they don't tell the person who has the job, who is a distinguished professional diplomat. The story breaks. It embarrasses Pat a great deal. And other things are happening. His wife and family want him home. He's been away from home. They stayed in Cambridge. The three children and his wife stayed in Cambridge. He commuted back and forth every weekend, and he paid for it himself. And he calls me to have lunch, to dinner, and he asks me if I want to be his deputy, and we discuss what he wants to do at the United Nations. He leaves dinner, and somewhere between the first and the fifth floor in his apartment building, he said, I can't do it. And he calls his wife, Liz, who is in tears. She's so thrilled that they're not going to New York. And he writes the president a letter. The letter is in the book, and it's an amazing letter. And he says, I can't do this. In a sense, he says, this would destroy my family. I can't do this. He said, secondly, I'm broke. He said, I came here with $60,000. I've spent it all. You can't go to New York and represent the United States without any money. Thirdly, Kissinger and Rogers really don't want me. This is something you're putting on top of me. Thirdly, the family assistance plan has now failed, and he happens to blame the Democrats who would not give Nixon the credit for its failure. So I'm going back to Harvard. And he does go back to Harvard, and they stay friendly, and they do a lot of commenting back and forth. And then 2 years later, Nixon calls him again and says, will you be ambassador to India? Now this had they liked that. His wife, who was an archaeologist, very interesting person, she liked that too. And actually used it to discover some major developments in India that wouldn't have happened had she not been the ambassador's wife. So they go off to India, and the book actually ends with a telegram he sends me, cable from India, that says, today the supplemental Social Security passed. There's going to be aid to disabled people, to people without sight, and so forth. He said, we didn't win it all, but we won this, and it's going to be a happier new year for all of us. And the book ends.
Thank you, Mr. Hess. Mr. Hess has agreed to answer some of your questions, but I have a quick question first.
Yeah.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan went on to become a senator, four-term senator of New York. Are there any lessons he took into the Senate from President Nixon?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't know how to answer it. He's certainly on his own. Moynihan as a senator was as unique as a senator as he had been unique as an advisor to the president. Every summer, when the Senate retired, he went off to his farm, upstate New York, where he had put a little one-room schoolhouse on the property. And he would go in it and get out his Olivetti typewriter, and he'd write a book about all sorts of things, a book about intelligence, a book about secrecy, a book about and George Will wrote, Moynihan has written more books than the average senator has read. He was really quite unique. He was unique as an advisor to the president. He was unique as a United States senator. And I don't know of any specific thing that I would say this was Nixon-esque. I should say, let me end this by saying, while I'm in the process of writing this book, I've had Nixon sightings, little things that I remember. They're not ready for a book, but they're ready for 2 pages. And one thing that I remember, which is more or less an appropriate way to end, was the last time I saw Richard Nixon. I should say that at the end of 1969, when Daniel Patrick Moynihan is made counselor to the president, basically cabinet officer without portfolio, where he would remain in the White House for the last year thinking good thoughts. Arthur Burns finally got his ambition and became the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And Nixon made me the chairman of the White House Conference on Children and Youth, which was something that had gone on, founded by Teddy Roosevelt, and every 10 years they had this. And I took that job, and after about a month, realized that in our society, in that moment in history, we could not have a successful conference on both children and youth. The problems were so different, they were so explosive with youth that they were going to overwhelm the real problems we had with children. So I asked the president if I could divide it into 2 conferences. So in 1970, I held the White House Conference on Children. In 1971, I held the White House Conference on Youth. and left the administration at that point. At the end, so in January, I joined the Brookings Institution, which I've been there since. And at that point, as often happens when you're a friend of the president's, you've served him, he invites the family into the Oval Office to say goodbye. It's a ceremonial thing. It's a photo op. Everybody wants their pictures taken. The kids get, my wife, 2 kids, they're 8 and 10 at that point. They get little trinkets. And I should say the president was never good at these functions. He was never at ease with them. He had certain set jokes that weren't very funny. And so we're sort of, and this is the end of the day. And he's next to get on a helicopter, which we can see right outside the Oval Office, to fly to Andrews Air Force Base, to fly to Ottawa, where he's to meet with the Prime Minister of Canada. And so there's a military aide who's getting a little restless, and we're having this conversation. And so it goes until the president says to my 10-year-old, "What's your favorite subject at school?" And Charlie, age 10, says geography. And Nixon's eyes literally light up. And he says, "That was my favorite subject too." And at this point, he takes my son and he starts walking around the perimeter of the Oval Office because he wants to show him all of the gifts he's received from the countries of the world, including the bonsai tree from China. And then he takes the 2 boys and he says, "This is a conservative president." He says, "I want you to travel when you're young, even if you have to borrow the money." And the next thing he does, he is imitating a little old man trying to come down a gangplank on a ship, cruise ship. And we're all laughing. Here's the President of the United States. Now that I'm almost 82, I don't think it's all that funny. But it was hysterical when we sat around watching the President imitate an old man coming down. And that is the last time that I, in person, saw Richard Milhouse Nixon. Next question.
Question in the 3rd row.
Hi, I'm Louis Meneses from Orange. Sir, in your opinion, do you think that President Nixon could have ended the Vietnam War in his first term?
Would have ended it.
Could he have?
Well, of course, it was ended in a sense in what became his first term because he was succeeded by Gerald Ford, and we evacuated helicopters and all during that period. So I think that would have been the same thing had he been given the extra 2 years. I don't know, I guess I can't say more than that. You know, when we all ask sort of what would happen, how do we really know what would happen? The biggest question I've asked as I go around is what happened with Moynihan and Nixon possible today? Possible today, given the state of our society, political society today. And I think about it, and I start to say no, but of course we had tremendous problems then too. In some ways greater. I mean, you know, we had a war in which 55,000 Americans were killed. We have wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but it's not of the same length. And length, not true, but 7,000 have died. We have protests now over race and so forth, but not 400,000 people marching on the White House. So we had problems at that time when these 2 different people could get together. So really, my answer to that question is, I don't know how it happened then, why it happened then. So how can we say if there would be 2 other people in this presidency, the next presidency, who could form a link like that? It does show. I mean, we spend a lot of time, we do as political scientists, thinking of organizational arrangements and so forth. We somehow never factor in, because it seems so arbitrary, such things as luck, such things as chance, such things as people actually liking each other or not liking each other. And that, I think, entered into the picture and really deserves to be accounted for and named. Sometimes you're lucky.
Got a question in the back row here.
not a question about Nixon. I actually have a 17-year-old son who is very much interested in going into the foreign services and the UN. Do you have any advice that I can give to him on how to how to achieve his dreams other than taking the foreign services test?
I can't give any advice on that. I've got a bunch of children myself. None of them went into foreign service, so I never had to face that advice. But they all did interesting things and somehow found their way without their father's guidance to get there. This evening on the way home, I'll stop in Los Angeles and have dinner with my son and his family, and he became a graphic designer. Makes a living, supports his family. I don't know how I could have led him to a career as a graphic designer, but he's good. That's it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hess.